Well, my father had been forever, really, from my perspective, an automobile mechanic in the old hometown here. And therefore, I was around the garage a lot. And in my formative years, it was the Chrysler garage in town, from which I just bought a car for Marge here recently. And that was an influence. And I was interested in it, of course. And in fact, really, I think the Korean War experience complemented the whole thing, because the National Guard outfit with which I went from the old town here to the war was a trucking company, would you believe? So that was another 19 months of activity like that. So that when I finished up my degree over at Penn State, the choices were either Chrysler or perhaps Pratt & Whitney aircraft. Those people needed some, I could offer some expertise along the lines of what my degree was I could offer some things that would complement what they were doing up in East Hartford. But on the other hand, when I went out to Detroit to interview, I'll never forget this. Walking down between a couple of buildings there at engineering with the guys who were taking us around and so forth, two things really reached me. One was that there was an A311 engine, one of the early Hemis that had been prepared in a special program for Indianapolis, and had at that point, I think in 1955 when we were out there, fundamentally it had become the Firestone Tire Company test engine for... Anyway, there was one of those running. Oh, brother, boy, was I impressed. And then, as the tour continued, we passed the transmission endurance lab. And this is a permanent impression as well. There was a C300, the Chrysler 300, it was called C300 in those days. Must have been a C300B or Baker, which would have been the 56 model, running on transmission endurance in the transmission lab. Now, what this amounts to is that there's this engine in the tranny that's being evaluated from an endurance point of view that are turning this huge flywheel, which approximates the weight of the car and so forth. And this thing would just go continuously. Oh man, that was the song, that was the music I wanted to hear. So that after that, there was Pratt & Whitney. They didn't know it immediately, but they were done. It was off to Detroit. I went in through the Chrysler Institute program, University of Michigan and so forth. I've forgotten now, but it was a 2-year program, and there were, how many? 6 or 8 assignments. There were a couple that were mandatory. I think everybody needed to go to the proving ground for one assignment, maybe the engine lab, so forth. But I went to the physics lab first, which is pretty obvious since that's what my work had been in. And since I had always had trouble keeping the spark plugs unfouled in my own cars at that time, I worked for a few months on trying to do something about making a spark plug a variable heat range, which we worked on, wrote a little paper on it and so forth. Then did the engine lab. I remember being at the proving ground. Remember going around the oval at the proving ground at 136 in a C300B, by the way, which was great fun, and things of that nature. Never did the tranny lab. I forgot what else. Didn't do the road test garage, but things of that nature, you know. It became obvious after the war, Second World War, that the market was exploding and it was going to be very competitive, and certainly the old line of long stroke L-head 6 and straight 6 and straight 8 engines that were Chrysler's forte simply weren't going to hack it. Obviously, there's crosstalk in Detroit, and it would have been known that Cadillac had a V8 coming, blah, blah, and so forth. so that some work was done on supercharging the L-head 6, for example. Things of that nature were looked at, and a Hemi head version of the inline 6 was evaluated, and the characteristics were very favorable. It pumps air well. It did a good job generally, so that some of the engineering decision makers then began to think very strongly about doing that on the V8 that was going to be required to be competitive, in the early 50s. And so that the ball got rolling that way and resulted in, there was not just the Chrysler original Hemi, but also a Dodge version, quite a bit smaller, and then an intermediate for the Desoto, which I've learned having restored my 57 Desoto over the last few years, which was quite similar to the Dodge in many ways, but what turned out to be a very good engine. It's interesting that some of the emission work that was done later on would suggest that the emission behavior of that engine, I think, the best the best cylinder combination, I believe it was a Nissan, was a Hemi without the catalyst. If you categorize emission performance without the catalyst downstream, the standard by which others were judged as we were approaching the catalyst era became a twin plug I say little, that may not be true, but anyway, I think it was a Nissan. And that would suggest that among big V8s, there could have been an argument offered that the late model Hemi, particularly with two plugs, could have done very well indeed on emission compliance performance. That's an interesting aspect of the original Hemi too. One of the reasons that the original Hemi came about was that the Chrysler management could see the Korean War coming, and there was a concern about availability of high-quality fuel, gasoline fuel, so that rather than take the wedge head high compression, so to speak, approach that Cadillac and GM took, Chrysler took the approach of keeping the compression ratio lower to accommodate what might have been a fuel quality problem during this war that was coming, and substituted instead the air pumping ability of the Hemi, and that was another factor that caused them to go ahead with the Hemi approach then for the first application was 51 model year in the Chrysler. Yes, the volumetric, we call it a volumetric efficiency, but how much air they'll pump related to how much they displace as they rotate was excellent, yes. There had been experience also. They had actually done it. I think maybe that scenario would have been a little different had there not been three separate versions of the Hemi. Had there been one, then the cost equation may have turned out a little differently. But when it became time then to commit to, well, there's another facet of all this. The Dodge was built, the engine was built at the Dodge plant, the Desoto engine was built at the Desoto plant, and the Chrysler engine was built at the Chrysler plant. Three separate operations, which is obviously not the efficient way to do it. Any business manager can tell you that. So when the time came to consolidate to one V8, actually it became two, the small Mound Road engine, which had a modern plant going for it at that point, and then the B engine down at Trenton, they went with the big Wedge. Yeah, a lot of it was cost. Many fond memories surface as you even say the word, by golly. Well, the Ramchargers was a group of drag racing enthusiasts that just naturally developed in Chrysler engineering. It was a very casual, loose confederation, if you will. In the beginning, we began meeting at, usually in the cafeteria at lunchtime. And I think Probably Wayne Erickson and now deceased, well, long since deceased, and myself were the perpetrators of this whole thing. The group got to be about, I suppose, at the height of things, maybe 15 guys, something like that. And like any other group, there were those who were more active and those who were less active and so forth. But highly qualified people, all, and with a relatively broad spectrum of background to offer, so that as individuals, we did pretty well. Wayne Erickson ran initially in what was called B gas in those days, which was a highly modified but still real car. I ran in what was called C gas, and Wayne and I did well, held the national records, that kind of thing. I won the nationals in 1960 and so forth. Finally, after a couple of years, we built a club car, which would have been the first real Ramchargers only car instead of a car owned by an individual member. There were other guys, you know, I don't want to slight anybody here by any means. Everyone had a car that they ran here, this or that class. But the club car, we had a very limited budget. The guys were, you know, we were young and getting families started and trying to buy houses, the kinds of things you do when you're out of school a couple of years and you've gotten married and so forth. So it was a very low budget proposition, but boy was it interesting. We built a C Altered, which was even more modified, yes, definitely, than any of the cars that the individual guys had. And it took the rule book and said, well, okay, how far can we go here? But it was very revolutionary in that it employed engineering principles to the problem more so than much of what had been the case up to that point, where it was sort of the seat of the pants, cut and try type thing. So again, because of the tire limitations, the approach that the Ramcharger car used was quite radical. It had a high center of gravity and so forth. And so was the engine, very radical. It had one of the first, so far as I'm able to remember, Ram manifolds on it, for example, tuned inlet manifolds. And it had tuned exhaust manifolds also. It was, as I say, quite high CG. It had a deep oil pan on it, which is yet another thing that was different and so forth. So that it was, well, the first outing, it had the best speed in C Altered at the Nationals, for example. It was very difficult to drive. It was unofficial. I think there were, obviously there were Ford racers and there were GM racers. There was a Ford group later, much later in the game. They fielded a car called Little Lord Fotis, which would be the flip side of Little Ford Lotus, you know, some guys from Ford Engineering. But no, there was nothing like the Ramcharger thing. When the decision was made largely by Mr. Townsend, who had taken over the, I'm not sure of the date, in the 60-61 time frame there, that some major changes regarding the image of the product had to be made, and the decisions were made and the finances were lined up to do it and so forth. We were at the ready. I mean, there was this group there that was a natural, especially for drag racing. So that, when the top management pulled the trigger there in October of '61, things happened right now. And we were very successful with the big Wedge drag car. People would find this difficult to believe, but it was never really an honest-to-God factory function. It was still a casual group of the guys. I'd say that the step discontinuity in the progression there time-wise was it was strictly the guys and for the heck of it and for fun and so forth until, I guess it was the summer of '61. I think a guy named Gale Porter from Dodge approached us and said, hey, why don't we give you a Dodge, and Dodge PR has some parts lined up and so forth, see what you can do in Superstock. In other words, we were out running in the classes that, although they would make a favorable impression and so forth, didn't directly relate to the product that was on the showroom floor. It was relatable, but not directly, because it wasn't exactly the vehicle that, you know, people might go in and buy. So I think we talked to both Plymouth and Dodge, and Dodge said, actually they talked to us back and forth, and it was, hey, right, why not do something that wouldn't cost us? In other words, they would supply the parts, we didn't have to go buy them and so forth, and use up our own cars. Take this Dodge. So they gave us a '61 Dodge, a white two-door hardtop. And Dan Mancini and I built the engine for it. I built the headers. I think I can show you a couple of burns on here, scars that are from that. And other guys did many other things, obviously. And there was a lawyer in the actually worked in the department where my wife worked as a secretary, became our driver, a guy named Al Ekstrand, who was, I think, about the best flagman driver I ever saw. Guy was a natural. Of course, he really worked at it. But that car then was the vehicle that I'd say at the national drags in 1961 on Labor Day that broke the ice, because we took the car down there. It was in Indianapolis, and some things happened that weekend that hadn't happened before and haven't happened since. It was incredible. I wish you could have been there. The guy, another facet of this whole thing, we stayed at this really grim motel, the 42nd Street Motel. Still a joke among the guys. But anyway, we took our '61 Dodge down there. Al Ekstrand drove, and the stock thing was still breaking through, if you will, in the racing market. Now, obviously, it had made its mark at Daytona Beach and NASCAR and so forth. But in drags, not really. It wasn't the dominant thing. I mean, you know, the dragsters and the wildly altered cars and so forth were being talked up. But in '61, that all changed. And I don't remember how many cars qualified, but Al qualified the Dodge. And boy, we were doing real well here. And I've forgotten now. I think there were 4 cars left. And Al, we had a manual transmission in it, and the old-time Chrysler guys will remember it had what we call pin synchronizers in the tranny. Wouldn't you know it, Al was doing real well. He couldn't get it in second gear, so he lost. But the crowd and everybody else was really impressed with how well the Dodge had done. So what was the turning point, I think, was that the announcer, on his own initiative, I guess, who knows, but he asked the crowd, one of the Chevys won, Nicholson, Don Nicholson, very famous drag racer. Don had won the race with Chevrolet, the 409, but the announcer asked the crowd if I think actually the show kind of stretched out and slowed down on them. You know, here it is Monday afternoon, it's beautiful, there's these, 70,000 people here rattling the stands and everything, but the show's kind of thinning out somehow, you know, and I think they wanted to stretch her out a little bit there, so it lasted till 5 o'clock or whatever. But in any case, the announcer asked the crowd if he'd like to see a match race between the Dodge and the Chevrolet that had won the race. Nicholson agreed, we sure agreed. Well, we had a 2 out of 3 match race, and we won. And the crowd went bananas. You know, and of course the Dodge PR guys were there, and the word got back to Detroit. And I think that really broke the ice, because then that would have been in September, first weekend in September. And the real program then actually got rolling in October, very shortly. When I say the program, that would be the A846. All the major programs at Chrysler Engineering, at least in those days, had an A number. I mentioned that A311 program, which was the background race developmental program for the original Hemi engine and so forth. The drag project, I remember it as the A846, which was the program for the engine. The wedge pack, we call it the Max Wedge package, still called that. Still runs very well indeed, by the way, and has a whole cult that follows it. That initiated in October '61. The 62 cars were successful. The 63 cars were dominant at the drags. I mean, boy, was that a neat time. You would have loved it. But in the meantime, the engine wasn't doing well. The whole package, the car, the engine, the tranny, and so forth, didn't do well at NASCAR. So in April of '63, the decision was made, hey, let's do something significant here so that we can go be competitive in NASCAR. So I still remember that. It would have been a month or two before the word came down, I think, through Bill Roger, who was heading up engineering at that time, or was certainly at the upper management level. We had a little meeting on the second floor of the big old engineering building out there on Oakland Avenue. Don Moore was there, I was there, maybe John Plattner. I don't remember whether Wortman was there or not, but, you know, 6 or 8 of the guys, hey, what can we do? Well, I know what we can do, you know. We knew what the A311 program could do. We knew what the Hemis had always done. Let's adapt a Hemi head to the basic big block wedge and go blow these guys away. So a guy named Jack Sherapar was in product planning at the time, and Jack carried the ball up then to the executive committee. Hey, the guys say that what it's going to take to do this and do it right and do it convincingly is to do a Hemi head for the and Mr. Townsend and the others said, right. So in April, the light went green, and by golly, the engines won Daytona Beach the following February, convincingly. Yeah. Daytona was very important, because if in NASCAR, if someone had won Daytona, they had a successful year right there, regardless of what happened later. So it was, although you could win the championship and so forth and all that, but boy, if you'd won Daytona, that was the big thing. And although we had turned the image of the company's products around already, really, among the young people who tended to be drag racers and so forth, and on the street, these big max wedges on the street were really tough and so forth. Still, the ink you get, you know, from the sports section of the paper that might impact somebody that wasn't interested in what was happening on North Woodward Avenue Friday evening, you know, or didn't go out there, could still be influenced and could gain respect for your engineering image and so forth through what he read in the paper, like Daytona Beach. So it was a thing that you needed to do in order to have the complete package. Pencil met paper to begin achieving the objective in April. I don't remember what day in April. I still remember the place. On some later jobs that I had, one of the later, I went in there representing Orbital one day in Chrysler Engineering, and went to the spot where the drafting board was. I know exactly where it is. You and I can go tomorrow. No problem. Bill knows where it is too, Bill Wortman. But a guy named Frank Bilk was one of the best layout men that we had in those days. And Frank was given the assignment of, hey, how do we get a good basic Hemi head on the raised B engine? And it was right next to the window. It was on the southeastern corner of the engine design room. The Hemi, the 426 late model Hemi, is just the last iteration performance-wise of what was done on the raised B engine. And it was a 426 displacement already when we started the Hemi head adaptation to it. Frank Bilk did the basic layout. I think the reason some people, particularly the drag racers, tend to relate me to it is that something you need to understand is that many people were involved. The team at Chrysler Engineering was not a large one, still isn't, so that it was a small group, but there were many active people. And I think the reason I'm associated with the late model Hemi, particularly by the drag racers and so forth, was that I think I'm the guy that had the idea with Frank Bilk as he was struggling with the fundamental parameters here. How do you get the head to fit on this block and still have the block come down the line at Trenton and so forth? There were several criteria that we laid out for ourselves that had to be met by the engine. One of the most difficult was that the relatively small B body, the body drop had to work. Now what that means is that the bottom of the car came along on one floor, and the car body, the sheet metal and so forth, came along on another floor, and the body dropped down over it, and then the car was completed. And that wasn't easy. To get the body to drop over that broad-shouldered engine wasn't easy, so we had a width limitation. Another limitation that we put on ourselves was that we didn't want the exhaust rocker, the rocker that operated the exhaust valve, to be any more massive or longer, rotating inertia and so forth, than the rocker on the original Hemi. So that told us how long the exhaust rocker dare be. We knew how wide the engine dare be. And the toughest nut to crack really was that the push rods had to allow enough gasket capability to seal well. In other words, you couldn't just run the push rod right down through the gasket, So putting all those together, the idea that I expressed to Frank, and then Frank went ahead and he had a gift of three-dimensional perception that few people on the planet have. There are gifted people like that. Frank was one of them. There are others. Forbes Bunning is another among the guys that were in on it, and a couple other guys. But Frank had that gift. And what essentially we did was that if this is the center line of the bore and this is the domed head, the way it was on the Desotos and the Dodges and the Chryslers and so forth, and the aircraft engines, Pratt & Whitney, Wasp and so forth, was like this. What we did was we tilted the head like this. So that if you look at a cross-section of the engine now, you'll see that a center line, a split between the two valves, doesn't go down the bore center line. Rather, it's at an angle. And this allowed the rocker to be short enough, it allowed the push rod to miss the bead on the head gasket, and it made the engine narrower enough. So I think that's the origin of all this father of the Hemi stuff that you hear. Just that one idea. But on the other hand, it's been very successful, and it allowed us to get the job done. Well, the word Hemi refers to the shape of the combustion chamber. It means hemisphere, which is half a sphere. And I don't think any engines have a real half a sphere. Visualize cutting a basketball in half and looking at it. Wow. They're shallow domes, but they are spherical. They would be part of some much larger. It wouldn't be half a dome, it'd be some smaller part of it. And fundamentally what that does for you is it allows you to maximize the valve size in a two-valve arrangement. Now, what this yields performance-wise is that having big valves means that you have better airflow. But I think a couple other facets of the combination of the Hemi and the raised B engine from the Max Performance Wedge and so forth have allowed the engine to be as successful as it's been over all these decades. It's still the engine of choice today. If you want to go 310 in a dragster, hey pal, there's only one way to get there. And there are a couple of reasons. The raised B structure is excellent. There is structure to support the enormous loads that the crankshaft sees that most other engine structure combinations don't allow, you know. So that this engine approach can keep the crankshaft off the street when you're generating this kind of power. And obviously the big valves are a factor. These days, particularly in the exotic fuel applications, they're putting enormous quantities of fuel through the engine. Not only air, but fuel also, so the big valves help there. But I think another facet of it that's really important is that the flow through it overlap is very good. Many people call Hemis a cross-flow engine. In other words, the air-fuel mixture comes in one side and goes out the other, so to speak. But when you're at top dead center and you're in what we call valve overlap, both valves are still open, the flow through is excellent, and part of the fuel is used actually to cool the parts, you know, in the application you see these days, because that excellent flow through at overlap allows the fuel and air then to cool off. Well, you don't care much about the intake valve. It's going to get cold regardless of what you do, but you are concerned to some degree about the temperature of the exhaust valve. It helps cool the exhaust valve off in the piston crown also, just better than other two-valve engines. And naturally aspirated becomes a limitation. The shape that the piston crown has to become in order to have the engine have high compression. The good news is that in spite of that grim shape of the piston crown and high compression, the flow through it overlap is still good. Where you get in trouble with that is at very high speeds, getting the rate of pressure rise and the burning accomplished in the very narrow window around top dead center is very difficult because it's such a grotesque shape. So that I think that's one of the reasons you don't see too many Hemis now naturally aspirated. Well, you see some Superstock A cars, for Pete's sake, are running in the 8s. Who would have, 150? I mean, a real honest-to-God Barracuda. Gee whiz. But anyway, the fuels that are used these days in the naturally aspirated gasoline drag cars are very exotic indeed. It's something I think that the aircraft people wouldn't have even dreamed of in, you know, 1950. So that allows very high compression, which the Hemi is difficult. It's a difficult challenge. At 16 to 1, that's tough to get a chamber that's going to burn well at 9,000 RPM. Did we know that the engine would be that it would become a cult item almost? You know what? I kind of think we sensed that. Particularly the guys that, like me, I really believe that. I think that when we got the green light to go ahead and adapt the Hemi head to the big B engine, that we realized that it would be one day something revered that everybody would look back on as something very special indeed. Yeah, we knew that. Especially the guys that, see, by that time I didn't spend all day just around engineering there. We were out in the racing environment and so forth, so that the group had gotten larger, many other people were involved, and it was a team effort that I think management could have learned from. You know, you read all about how Toyota and the lean, mean machine manufacturing and blah, blah, all this stuff. I think some of observers back in '63, had they watched how the group, all inclusive, everybody that even touched the damn thing, got the job done, could have learned something about a flat team. Everybody has ownership. Everybody's involved.
Working together.
Yeah, it was something special, I'm telling you, you know. Workman was down at the foundry personally, tweaking everything to make it work, you know, and Bob Lechner's driving engines in the back of a pickup all night down to the beach, and all of us are, you know, it was really something. That was a golden age, and probably the initial Hemi effort was the pinnacle, if you will, of the golden age. Yeah. It was expensive, it was heavy, it was large, and the American industrial mindset was different in those days. Only recently have all of us begun to understand that people will pay more money for something that's really worth it. And the mindset simply didn't exist in those days that could realize that might be a truth that you could. I often wonder if some enlightened people back in that era had tried that, what would have happened? Turned out that the Mercedes from Europe, the BMW from Europe, the various high-quality Japanese cars with multiple valves and double-tuned intakes and all the trick stuff, hey, people began to appreciate, or people will appreciate. It's like buying a good camera. You pay more for the good stuff. I enjoy talking about it, and one of the motivations is that when you go down to the drugstore, we all do, or the bookstore, and you look at some of the stuff that's in the vernacular these days, and you flip it, and you, holy man, you know, what's this? I don't remember. So, particularly the last few years, I've been going to various of the gatherings of the enthusiasts, the car restoration groups and so forth, and giving a little talk in the evening, the Saturday night banquet type thing and so forth. Because a lot of stories have snowballed, you know, which aren't really all that accurate as to what really went on and why. First street Hemi was '66 model year. The first street Hemi was basically a detuned race engine. No, it had a different crank from the real race engine.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Well, same crank dimensionally and so forth. It didn't have full radius. The race engine had full radius. The street Hemi crank was undercut. I think shot peened in the fillets, that kind of stuff. But basically, very similar to the A864. The first street Hemis were a little crude for the average guy on the street. You know, the idle, a little lumpy, and the mechanical lash adjustment and so forth. A clutch that was very difficult to operate and whatnot. I think that the street Hemi to have is the '68 or later, where some refinements were made that were more suitable for the street. I think my only regret looking back on all that was that whatever influence I exerted to make it an 8-barrel, although it was probably the right thing to do in '66 and '67 and so forth, a little later in the game, well, had the emission thing not begun to exert the influence it did, and had the insurance problem. That was another problem, by the way. the insurance companies really started to come down hard on all this muscle car stuff, particularly with young owners in '69 and '70. But anyway, I think there was a place for either a single 4-barrel version of the engine, a little more domesticated, or maybe even a 6-barrel version. We had some passes at that. My own favorite was the 6-barrel version. Boy, that was a really neat piece of equipment. These are just things we looked at. We had a couple of them running around. Well, Chrysler had a real image problem. In spite of the Hemi engines, which gave most people the feeling that Chrysler engineering was on the ball and so forth, the trannies were limited. They had the so-called clunkomatic and so forth. But the image was not good. And the turning point there came when Mr. Townsend became the chief operating officer of the company. He had a couple of teenage boys, which apparently took Dad aside and said, look here, Father, you've got a problem with your product. And I often wonder if they had wandered out on North Woodward. I heard stories to that effect and so forth. I never met those young men myself, although I had met Mr. Colbert's son, who had been known to venture out on Woodward and so forth. But things like that made Mr. Townsend reach the conclusion that something had to be done to change the image around. And I think the old axiom, you can sell an old man a young man's car, but you're in real trouble if you're trying to sell a young man an old man's car, is the one that pushed him in and made him realize that something had to be done. And in the summer of '61 there, particularly after we did well at the Nationals with that '61 car, boy, the green light went on, and I still remember going over to engine design, essentially with a blank check. Saw Wertman and the guys, and hey, boy, we were going to let it happen. And we did. And it was again, I think something that American industrial management would have benefited from observing a little more closely as to what could be done with a real clearly focused, all participatory team approach. Not that that wasn't used at all. The A901 program, for example, at Chrysler was something like that, where they got a building off somewhere and they went off and did the Valiant, more or less separately, successfully. But anyway, I think the race program, a couple things that happened there, could have been a real guiding light to the guys, Deming and others, who've expanded on all that later, would have recognized those efforts as being something special that worked well.